taking yours. I'm here.
Okay. Right, it's exactly 6 o'clock? Just to check, 2 minutes late, never mind. So welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you all here for our very first event, the Center for Irish German Studies this semester. And I'm like beyond delight, I have to admit, with our speaker today, because it is such a wonderful, it's not the first time that David Donoghue is here, but it's hopefully not the last time, but there is no better speaker than David Donoghue. And on the topic, there is, and I think this is kind of just a really good framework for our future discussions. And at UL, we have already very strongly and for a while integrated the Sustainable Development Goals in our thinking, in our preparation, and in the university mission as well. So it is really good to use the expertise, I would hope, on both sides, and I say Ireland and the German-speaking countries, and kind of learn from each other and get an insight in what is there and hear about it. And I'm very happy that the center can contribute to that in a small way. So without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over to Professor Shane Kilcommins, Provost and Deputy President of the University of Limerick, who has very kindly agreed to chair today's event. So he will introduce our speaker, and then he will chair the question and answer session afterwards. Shane, over to you.
So, esteemed guest David, colleagues, friends, you are really welcome to this seminar this evening. It promises to be a wonderful evening, and what a title, The Story Behind the UN Sustainable Development Goals. To have somebody of the caliber of David here to actually speak to us about this, and particularly the assumptions and commitments and principles underpinning these SDGs, I think is phenomenal. I'd like to begin, I think, by thanking Gisela and colleagues in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. I had the privilege for a short time of being the Dean of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and what was really striking for me was the really strong culture of scholarship that existed in the faculty, and in particular in the languages sections, and that sense of collegiality and togetherness that was so apparent there. So, you know, that always shines through, and particularly in events like this, that we can come together, that we can share these insights. And it's a real esteem indicator of the centre, but also I think of the school and the faculty, to have somebody of the calibre of David here with us to inform us, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps even, you know, to mobilise us on our understanding of these 17 goals. So well done to all concerned for having David here this evening. And I'd like as well to, you know, formally introduce David, and in doing so, just to note that he's had a really long and varied career in Ireland's diplomatic service. He was involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. He was on the Irish government negotiating team for the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which has provided such a strong and lasting, you know, platform for peace and stability in Northern Ireland, and it has endured. He has served from 1995 to 1999 as the Irish Joint Secretary at the Anglo-Irish Secretary in Belfast, and then at different times he's held various ambassadorial roles. So he was the Irish ambassador to Russia between 1999 and 2001, also to Austria between 2004 and 2006, and to Germany between 2006 and 2009. And in the Department of Foreign Affairs between 2001 and 2004, he was the Director General of Irish Aid, Ireland's Development Cooperation Programme. And again in 2009, between 2009 and 2013, he was also the Department of Foreign Affairs Political Director. And a post that gave him responsibility for Ireland's overall foreign policy and for many associated thematic aspects. And then we're here to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. But between 2013 and 2017, he was the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations in New York. And at the request of the President of the General Assembly, then along with another co-facilitator, he co-chaired the UN negotiations, which led to the groundbreaking adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the wider agenda for sustainable development. He's also served as co-facilitator with Jordan for the UN negotiations, which in 2016 led to the New York Declaration on Large Movements of Refugees and Migrants. So David retired from diplomatic service in September 2017, but he has remained very, very active. So he was actively involved in the national and international efforts to promote the implementation of these Sustainable Development Goals. He also contributes to work of several think tanks and academic institutions on various issues, and they include overseas development. And he also works with the Robert Bosch Foundation in Germany. And it should be noted as well that he's a chairperson of the Conciliation Resources, a peace-building organisation based in London. And perhaps I'll conclude, not in my own words, I wish they were my own words, but they're in Gisela's words. And she notes as follows: in summary, coming out of UCD with beautiful writing skills and an intellect second to none, David set off to build agreements, declarations and new institutions to ensure peace and sustainable development on the island of Ireland and indeed the world. And I think, you know, as a lawyer, what I can simply say is that he has surely achieved this. The evidence speaks for itself, and particularly in terms of the profile that I've just spoken to you about. So without further delay, I'll hand over now to David to speak to us about these goals. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Shane and Gisela. Extremely pleased and honoured to have been asked to speak this evening. I feel sitting up here like a judge about to kind of hand down a sentence, so you'll forgive me. All I'm missing is a gavel. And funny enough, at the UN, that's the key piece of equipment. You have to have a gavel in order to decide that a negotiation is over. It's extremely undemocratic. You don't take a vote. You simply lift a small hammer and hope that the moment that you gauge the moment correctly, you bang it down and declare that the agreement in question is adopted. You risk having 50 countries protest and say you've got that wrong and it's outrageous. But we were very, very lucky with the Sustainable Development Goals that myself and my colleague, who was the ambassador of Kenya, managed to judge the moment correctly. So we have the SDGs in consequence. What I would propose to do is just speak for about 25 minutes, roughly speaking, about how the SDGs came into existence, what their meaning is, what their potential is, and then I would very, very happily take questions, because in many ways we can get into the heart of the issue better through questions. Why am I sitting here at all, or why was the Irish ambassador involved in these negotiations? The way it works at the UN is that when they are preparing for a very large and complex and sensitive negotiation, they frequently ask an ambassador from what's called the Global North to team up with one from the Global South. So developed and developing countries, although we've tried to get over that kind of binary distinction. But they ask somebody from the Global North to team up with a colleague from the Global South in order to chair that particular negotiation. The idea being that the person from the Global North would have some understanding of the concerns and sensitivities for developed countries, and the one from the South would have the same for developing countries. It means that you are not simply convening meetings, but you have the responsibility of putting a draft agreement on the table and gathering comments, protests, complaints, the odd bit of praise, until the point where you can gavel the finally agreed document through. So it's a rather crude way of achieving a global agreement, but on the whole, it works. So in this particular case, in the year 2014 to 15, Ireland and Kenya were asked to chair these negotiations, and that's why I found myself in that position. Why Ireland? Partly it's because we would be seen as an honest broker. We are a small country in Northwest Europe, which at the same time has a kind of an open, sympathetic attitude to the problems of developing countries. If you think about Irish missionaries in Africa, if you think about Irish NGOs, and we have a very good aid program, as Shane mentioned earlier, Irish Aid, which is respected throughout the world. So I suppose some of those factors explained why I was asked to take it on. Kenya, in turn, is a leading developing country, so it was for the two of us to form a team and to try to keep unity within the team among ourselves so that we would have the best chance of getting the SDGs agreed. What are the SDGs and why are they so important? Well, I presuppose that you all know relatively little about them, so those who are better informed, please forgive me, but I'll try to start from basics. It is often considered useful that countries would set goals for themselves in order to maximize the effectiveness of their policies and the use of their resources. So around the year 2000, it was felt that the world needed a set of goals which came into existence then. This is in 2000, and they were called the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. And these were valid for the years 2000 to 2015. But they were simply about there were 8 of them, and they were about the classic development issues of health, education, food safety, gender equality, as I say, the classic poverty eradication issues. They were never actually negotiated. They were simply dreamt up by a couple of officials at the UN and announced. So what it meant was we had the 8 goals, which were, depending on how you measure it, they were achieved to some extent. But if I'm being honest, the main reason why we could conclude that the MDGs were achieved to about 2/3 was that China, in that 15-year period, amended its economic policies, bringing in more of a market economy approach. So that meant that China on its own was able to lift a large portion of its population out of poverty. So one of the key MDGs was effectively achieved by China on its own. So I won't go into detail about the rest, but let's just say 2/3, 3/4 would approximate to the degree of achievement. But in the subsequent 15 years, there was a strong belief around the world that the concept of sustainable development had to be brought center stage. And that means recognizing that you can't just have short-term fixes where you sort of think that you have solved a problem and then a year later it pops up again. You have to recognize that poverty requires a concerted, holistic approach if you're going to eradicate it. You cannot just tackle health challenges on their own. You can't tackle education on its own. You can't tackle gender equality. You have to look at them all holistically. So this sense of achieving development which would last beyond the day, beyond the month, beyond the year, which would have a longer term value. That idea of sustainable development only really came into its own in the years from about 2010 onwards. It had been around for about 40 years before that as a concept, but it hadn't really acquired traction. So number one, there was a sense that we had to look at the next development agenda from 2015 until 2030, the successor to the MDGs. We had to look at that in a much more holistic way, addressing the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, what are called the economic, the social, and the environmental. So they cover basically the classic issues around eradicating poverty. They cover protecting the planet and preventing any greater degradation than we already have, including climate change. And they cover also having economic policies which are in themselves sustainable and which do not involve destroying the planet. So the three dimensions of sustainable development, it was agreed, would have to be considered as we looked at the next set of goals. The second big difference from the MDGs, apart from the breadth of the agenda, the second big difference was that in contrast to the MDGs, there was now a very strong feeling that every country in the world had to approve what was being decided. In other words, they would have to be negotiated word for word, even comma for comma, by 193 countries. So we would have to have the approval of almost 200 countries to every word of the new goals. That was a strong view around the world. And the third difference was that there would be a single document which came out of this process, a single text, if you like, which would be valid which would be accepted by every country in the world, and without regional variations, a single document for all 193 countries, rich and poor. So they call that universality. So we were aiming for a set of commitments which would be implemented as much by the US, by Russia and China, as by the Marshall Islands or Vanuatu, the tiniest countries. So it was an ambitious undertaking, and my role basically was that the way it panned out, I did a lot of the drafting. My Kenyan colleague was strong on sort of lobbying his own, the other developing countries. But when it came to the drafting, perhaps the fact that I was a native speaker of English helped. Perhaps between one thing and another, I ended up doing a lot of the work on the actual document which came out. So there are several parts to what we call the Sustainable Development Goals. The official title, by the way, is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it's all meant to be achieved by 2030. I'll get to that in a moment. I don't think we'll make it, but nevertheless, I'm describing to you the high hopes we all had in 2015. The first part of it is 17 goals. A goal typically, you would think I have them all learnt off by now. I don't, but might be something like the health goal might be we promise or we pledge to achieve affordable quality health care for every man, woman and child. I mean, the health goal is something like that. Under each goal, there would be 7 or 8 targets, which are really like sub-goals. So there might be a sub-goal about maternal health. There might be another one about children's health. There might be another one about infectious diseases or something. So if you like, it should be sub-goals under each. So there are 17 goals, 169 sub-goals or targets. A key point is that the agenda is vast in the sense that it covers almost literally everything under the sun. So health, energy, education, environmental preservation, gender equality, food security, access to water, peace is even part of it. Climate has a goal to itself. There has never been as comprehensive a global agenda as this. It was the first time the UN had ever attempted it. They certainly had never attempted it with every country in the world having a veto over every word. So that was particularly ambitious. The result was that we set off on these negotiations with knowing that every country would want to assert its own interests and would want to show that the delegates at our negotiations would want to show their governments that they had fought hard on every point. So we had a rather contentious and fractious atmosphere for quite a long time. But I suppose the key point I wanted to make there was a very, very broad agenda, but it's not legally binding. It could not have been legally binding. Many people in civil society were hoping that it would be legally binding, because that would force governments to raise their sights and so on. But if you think about it, you're aiming for something which every country in the world can agree to. A tiny developing country which has almost no data, no statistics, no bureaucracy, is not going to put itself into a straitjacket where if it doesn't achieve rapid enough progress on the SDGs, it will somehow be punished by the other countries. That's the way they saw it. So the tiniest, for example, South Pacific Island states, they did not want to make themselves legally liable for underperformance. And what would legally liable have meant? Well, it would have implied some kind of world court which would, you know, make all these countries accountable and perhaps impose financial sanctions. It was never realistic to imagine that. So instead, the SDGs are what I call politically binding, even morally binding, but they're not legally binding. That means that, in effect, we are hoping that they will be achieved by peer pressure. So let me give you kind of an invented example of this. Let's take, say, Mexico. We'll imagine that Central America is the region. Mexico is the largest country in Central America. Mexico might imagine that it is the market leader on education in Central America, but in fact it might be underperforming on health. But then it might see that Guatemala, a small, poorer neighbor, is actually outperforming it on health. So Mexico, the theory goes, has an incentive to improve its own performance on health so that it is not politically embarrassed by the smaller neighbor. I mean, that's a slightly crude example of it, but we are relying on countries looking over their shoulders, especially at their neighbors. I mean, Ireland is not going to be particularly conscious of how Cambodia does on the goals, but it might be very conscious of how Denmark does, another small Northern European country. It doesn't want the political embarrassment of being compared, perhaps unfavorably, with another country. So it sounds almost childish, but to be honest, that is a key motive for countries. It also explains why every country in the world opted in to this framework. Even, and I'll, you know, previously I've been more discreet about this, but even Russia, whose readiness for confrontation is now all too obvious. Russia traditionally is a contrarian at the UN. Even Russia decided that it was better to be inside the tent than outside the tent. They were relying on a couple of phrases which I had to put in on the lines of subject to national priorities or within the limits of countries' planning. Or I had a couple of caveats which were designed as discreetly as possible to leave the door open if a country genuinely couldn't achieve the speed of progress we needed. But so Russia was probably relying on that. China, for example, was hugely enthusiastic about the SDGs and still is. So every country felt it was better to work these new goals, to try to frame their national policies around the goals. And no country is saying this is all a waste of time. So I'll just briefly talk about how we actually got there, what were the problems, and then what has been happening ever since. So we had negotiations lasting about 9 months, and the room was packed every day. There would have been 500 or 600 delegates in this UN chamber because every country in the world had a vested interest in all parts of this new agenda. They would have health experts there, they'd have education experts, they'd have environmental experts. You then had a massive amount of civil society. You had the gallery was packed every day with NGOs who were trying to pressurize the delegates below. And dare I say it, European countries have no problems really, or few problems with NGOs being present at negotiations. but many developing countries are actively opposed. They say civil society has no right to be here. So there were tensions all around that. The NGOs were trying to force the governments worldwide to stretch themselves in terms of what they would try to do on education, what they would try to do on food security, and so on. You also had a potential tension over the role of the two chairmen, because again, this is hard to believe, but many developing countries, as such negotiations continue, get suspicious about the two chairs, and in particular about the one from the north. They imagine that their interests are being undermined or could be undermined by the one from the north. So frequently, the two chairs are thrown out in the last week, and the developing countries insist that there be no chairs, and that the various drafts of the document concerned are put up on on a screen, and somehow we all try to navigate our way through this complete dog's dinner. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but often negotiations at the UN collapse over this, because when the two chairs go, there is just chaos as we try to work out what draft is from whom and so on. We were determined, my colleague and I, that no matter what, we would retain the confidence of all the countries. It helped, to be honest, that Ireland is respected, say, in Africa. I think they felt that we didn't have a neo-colonial agenda of our own. We've no colonial agenda. And gradually they realized that Ireland would probably look after their interests more than, say, some European countries with a colonial past. So all these things helped. Since I was doing the drafting, I also had to do a draft of a declaration that went with the goals. And this declaration, in effect, was all the world leaders saying what they meant by the goals, what they attached importance to, how the goals would be achieved, with what resources, etc. So a particular phrase that I largely came up with was that the world leaders pledged to leave no one behind. And this, I know it may seem rather sort of vague and so on, but what did we mean by that? We meant that this isn't an agenda purely by governments and for governments. We were trying to make the point that every country in the world would deliberately prioritize the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable groups. So it can be children, it can be people with disabilities, it can be indigenous peoples, it can be migrants. I stuck in a series of references, illustrations of what we meant. But the two key phrases were, as we set out on the road to 2030, we pledge to leave no one behind. That means we're actually trying to prioritize the needs of people, not just governments, not just economies, and most of all, the most vulnerable people. And the second sentence was, I didn't think I would get away with this, but the second sentence was, we will endeavour, that was the compromise, we'll endeavour to reach the furthest behind first. So what I meant by that was that in the first 3 or 4 years, that every government was committing itself to tackling most of all the needs of the poorest groups. Of course, they all accepted it on the basis of endeavour, so they could wriggle out of it if they wanted to. It didn't happen, of course, but it was useful leverage, that civil society can now say to every government in the world, you promised to do your best to look at the needs of the poor migrants, and it can be children, it can be women, it can be, there are various examples. You pledged to do that and you haven't done it. So it gives civil society good sort of moral leverage. So frankly, I was able to stick in a few phrases like that because I was coming from a background where I was open to civil society. I was getting submissions from NGOs and I managed to persuade my Kenyan colleague to go along with them. And then we managed to persuade every country in the world to go along with that, which was a pleasant surprise. Many countries, I don't want to name names too much, but you can imagine there are countries who ban all the civil society, and sometimes we had to almost deceive countries and, you know, play little tricks to distract them just at the moment where we were getting a particular piece of language through. So either way, the language is as we have it, and civil society were very happy with that. They thought that they felt that they had contributed to the birth of the SDGs, and that they were in the room while they were being negotiated, and they could actually talk to delegates in the interval. So they have a real sense of being part of the whole process, and that is good, because it means that they don't think that governments did it on their own, and they therefore can't really criticize. They see themselves as partners with governments in achieving the goals. Let me move to how we're actually trying to implement them around the world. Well, every country agreed to set up national coordination arrangements, a kind of a platform where you would have the government, the civil society, academic and research community, cities, even universities. I'll come back to that in a moment. All the stakeholders, that's the phrase used, and the private sector. Most of all, the private sector, because they have greater resources than anybody else. So the idea is that a kind of a coordinating platform of government plus will oversee implementation of the goals in every country, and will then report to the UN every few years on the progress. So there is a conference each year at the UN which invites countries to lay out how they are doing. That is one way in which we could see, are these SDGs catching on or not? I believed, frankly, in the first few years that we would find not that many countries willing to come to the UN to describe what they're doing. We even had to call these kind of national reports voluntary national review, VN, or voluntary national review. Why is that? Because too many developing countries said, we will not be forced to tell you how we're doing. They were obviously feeling a little bit defensive. After a while, the word voluntary disappeared, because every country in the world can't wait to come and talk about what it's doing. There's an element of beauty contest, it must be said. Some countries want to show their neighbours that they are way ahead of them, whatever it takes. So it's easier to give it in figures. Out of 193 countries, I think 178 have so far given a national review at least once. Some are coming now for the third time. That means that if you allow for tiny countries with no central statistics office, effectively every country in the world has embraced the SDGs. During the Trump administration, to be honest, we were bracing ourselves for Trump saying he didn't like the SDGs. He didn't. He, of course, took the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He took them out of the Iran Agreement. He took them out of other UN things. He didn't actually touch the SDGs. And my guess is that it was because no specific financial commitment was required. So even though he didn't like UN agreements as such, he wasn't required to actually make a contribution, unlike with the Paris Climate Agreement. So for whatever reason, the US did not withdraw from the SDGs. And now, of course, with Biden, we're back into a positive mode. I should say that Obama was one of the biggest champions of the SDGs. So it was only really Trump we were worried about. So as of today, every country in the world is signed up to the SDGs, is enthusiastic about them, can't wait to come and give a report about its progress, etc. Now we move to the bad news. How have we actually done, even though the framework, if you like, was so promising? Well, in the first few years, we had to actually get these new arrangements up and running. So that I was talking about. So in a sense, we weren't, those didn't count. But by about, say, 2018, we should have been able to show some progress under individual goals. Economic growth became sluggish around the world. You had, continuing conflict of one kind or another. You had the migration crisis. You had vast amounts of resources needed for climate action. So there were a number of reasons holding us back from massive investment in the SDGs. Then came COVID. COVID, of course, knocked back the ability of many countries to do what was required. Of course, it emphasized more than ever the importance of the health goal, and you can argue that the investments in health systems are implementation of the health goal, and therefore that part of the agenda is getting attention. Or say social protection, same thing there. But on the whole, the pandemic did affect the ability of countries to achieve the progress required. How the UN reacted, strangely enough, what I mean by that, the Secretary General of the UN and you know the UN system, how they reacted was to say, far from the SDGs being less relevant to the kind of world we want to build after the pandemic, or from the pandemic, they're more relevant than ever. The phrase used is building back better. That's what the UN Secretary General says. We want to build back better with the SDGs. So they are now accepted by everybody as more relevant. It still doesn't mean that we're making the kind of progress required. How do we know that? If you check how countries are doing on the individual goals and targets, most countries are in reverse on some of the goals, because in the meantime you have the Ukraine war adding to the shock of the pandemic. So we have this great framework, but nobody's actually implementing it. There were only 7 years left. We're now at the halfway point, 7 years, yeah. And there will be a review conference this year where happily Ireland is again co-chairing the negotiations on the review document, Ireland and Qatar. We will all take stock of where we go to with the SDGs, but it's becoming an increasingly open secret that they won't be achieved by 2030. Simply, you know, we're too far behind. My guess is that we will simply call them the 2040 agenda or something. I think what will happen is that the same set of commitments will be folded over into the next period. We might even add a couple. We're not going to subtract any. I think it will be the same set of commitments. So whether you call it the 2030 agenda or the 2040 agenda, it's still going to be the world's blueprint as we go forward. No country has resiled from it, and it's the only uncontested global agenda. There is nothing else. I mean, the Paris Climate Agreement is contested, happily not by many, but it is contested. The SDGs aren't. So it's like it's an asset that we have to build on. I'm sure I've gone well over my 25 minutes, but I'll stop at this point to give you a breather, and I will happily take questions. Perhaps just one final sentence. You know, why should we have these goals or any such goals? I think it's because it allows governments to plan their activities, their policy priorities better. They have a finite amount of resources. With the private sector, which is just as enthusiastic about the SDGs, I mean the international private sector, with that governments can actually multiply the resources they have to address these development challenges, which are challenges for the whole world and for which we really need global solutions. So the SDGs are based on the premise that, you know, that the pandemic has shown us that we are all interconnected with the kind of health issues we face, with education, that these are in themselves interconnected. But, you know, Ireland's challenges in the area of health are the same as Turkey's, are the same as Guatemala's, that in many ways we will only get lasting solutions if we work multilaterally on them. Nobody has actually suggested that we should tear up the SDGs and go back to more, you know, regional agreements. I think the feeling is that the global route is still more or less the only way to go. So if we didn't have the SDGs, we would be missing a framework for using our resources productively. and in this kind of systematic way. That's, I think, the main value of them. They may seem utopian. They are utopian, I'll be quite honest. The actual goals themselves, the targets, which are mainly numerical targets, and then the sentiments which were agreed to in the document. They were utopian, but you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is utopian and still seen as a landmark document. So I think the SDGs have the same status. I'll stop at this point and would be delighted to answer any questions, try to answer any questions you may have.
I'm going to stand to the side so that the focus is entirely on you. Interesting discussion. I've written a number of points down, but I thought that phrase really more often see military and rhetoric as an emboldening reference point, but I actually what it really speaks to the dignity of each individual, the intrinsic value of each human being. Walking uses the phrase, I think that we should mind how each individual is. Lovely as well to have our president with us this evening for the discussion. So over to you for questions.
I have two questions today. One, that there are conflicting targets, and I'm curious as to how they can be resolved given the fact that each state, no matter how small, company can see themselves as having the same. And the other is, why was it decided to give
Okay, just on the first question, I just want to be precise. No, the individual targets should not be in conflict with each other. At least I hope not, because we went to great trouble to ensure that they were compatible. These are often sort of numerical targets, you know, that we pledge to reduce by 50% within 5 years the number of children who child mortality or something. I mean, that would be an example of a target. I'm just wondering what I said that might have perhaps been a bit confusing.
You were confused by me. It so happens I have a critique in my hand where they talk about the agenda does not provide the means of resolving the challenges between advancement towards conflicting targets.
Yes, and again, I'm just wondering what they meant by conflicting targets. But there are, you know, I suppose one of the problems is that the agenda, that's the term used for the entire framework, the goals, targets, and then the various the documents that go with it. The agenda is hugely ambitious, and it could be argued, for example, that if you are trying to promote you know, industrial development, that might be in conflict with clean air, you know, that sort of thing. There are, I mean, the phrase often used there is that you have to watch out for trade-offs. I have to say I had to get used to that term myself. A trade-off actually means a conflict or a dilemma, a contradiction between one goal and another. So the positive way of looking at it is that you can create synergies between one goal or target and another. But then the negative thing is where one goal or target in some way undermines another. So that's what we call those trade-offs. The simple answer, probably too simple, is that each government has to decide on the best possible trade-offs from its point of view, and it might be that Ireland will go for one set of, you know, Ireland will reconcile these dilemmas in one way, and Australia might do it in another way. I mean, for example, if you were to have, say, I'm inventing this example, you know, there might be a big urban development on the coast of Australia, which is threatening the local fisheries industry. So the urban development might be seen as implementing SDG 12 or whatever. I'm still fuzzy on the exact numbers, believe it or not. But equally, there's another goal, number 13, which is about aquaculture and marine. So there's a contradiction between those two. The Australian government might decide that urbanisation is more important to it than protecting the aquaculture. Ireland might take a different view. So there will be many examples of a government which will go its own way. But the SDGs allows governments to go their own way. There are no ways are prescribed, as it were. And I should make another important point, which is that there's no benchmarking like that each government is meant to achieve everything by 2030. This is why I say utopian. So there's nothing requiring Ireland, for example, to achieve goals such and such or targets such and such by 2023. Ireland could do nothing for 14 years and then do everything in the last year. It's left to each country to decide the speed and the rate at which it will achieve the goals. You can see that it's highly unlikely that we will achieve all goals for every country by 2030. But I think what we're hoping for is that enough of a difference will have been made that some countries will be closer to the finishing line than others. Now, at the moment, no country is anywhere near the finishing line, but let me pick a country offhand. Someone like Norway would be traditionally seen as a country which is wealthy, it's socially conscious, it has a strong record in tackling poverty, it's willing to spend a lot of money to achieve these valuable goals. Even Norway was, when we started on this, would not have been at the finishing line. So we deliberately used this metaphor of everybody setting out together, almost like a race. But we were hoping that we'd all make it to the finishing line by 2030, but some would be ahead of others. So in the meantime, we're all barely at the starting blocks to pursue the metaphor. But so long-winded answer to your question, but basically it's for every government to resolve its own, whatever contradictions it sees. And conversely, each government can set its own priorities. So for example, Ireland could decide that it's going to focus on gender issues in the first couple of years, and then they'll do food safety later on, whatever. That's for Ireland. Your second question was about gender equality. The reason is simply that there was a very strong view that the predicament of women in many developing countries, the contribution they make to development, but the challenges they face, that these issues are so central that there had to be a goal, especially to address the needs of women and the role to be played by women in achieving development objectives. So that would have reflected, many views around the world, and frankly also civil society influence. There would have been some developing countries who would have cautioned about that, but it was our job, myself and my Kenyan colleague, it was our job to try and broker an agreement on everything, and that meant coming towards the end that there were all kinds of rows and confrontations, and we had to sort of strong arm people in the corridors, more or less, and we had to do deals. There would be trade-offs, but we'd say to one group of countries, we can give you 3 of the things you want on your list, but not the other 3. It was horse trading, basically. For the first while, we were able to solve some of the problems by fudging, by deliberate verbal imprecision, for which I was the expert. But then there comes a point where you can't bridge gaps anymore. You have to just simply say, we'll give you A, B, and C, but you have to accept D, E, and F. And all I can say is we used some very crude techniques to bring the whole thing to a conclusion. We had a deadline. The deadline was the 31st of July that particular year. And we kept on insisting that this deadline was sacrosanct. We weren't going to go over it by even a minute. The problem there was that many countries said, what's the hurry? You're setting a deadline of the 31st of July. The summit to announce the new goals isn't until the 25th of September. Can't we keep negotiating throughout August? We were determined not to allow that, because then many countries would get the idea to exercise brinkmanship, that they would deliberately try to blackmail the rest of us by refusing to agree up to the 23rd of September. We were determined not to allow that, but it meant that we had to come up with some totally phony reason as to why we had to stop on the 31st of July. So we began by saying the UN doesn't have any rooms available in August. Field rubbish. We're all going on our holidays in August. The only problem was that all the African countries don't regard August as a holiday month. It was a working month for them. Eventually, my colleague and I started waiving airline tickets, as if to say we're going on our holidays on the 1st of August, no matter what. There was nothing in the tickets, but it was just a trick. But then the crudest trick of all was we said that it has to be finished by 31st of July, and we then wouldn't let them go home. We kept them up all night, 2 nights in succession. And I still remember at 5 a.m. on one night seeing 30 ambassadors in the front rows sitting there fast asleep. They were, I mean, we were half asleep, but we were determined to exhaust them. Why? Because that was a serious point. We wanted them to be able to say to their governments, we didn't sleep for 2 nights in order to do the right thing by our governments. So it meant that by the last day, which was actually the 2nd of August, we were only 2 days over, they were begging for release, and it meant that we then, managed to get enough consensus to bring all the countries into the room, and we lifted the little gavel and banged it down at a point where we had 165 countries in favour. We should have gone for, we were risking that there wouldn't be some troublesome countries among the last 25 who would say, but what about us? We just decided that we had enough momentum and we just called it. And the other countries protested a bit, but it was all over. So these are really crude techniques, but it's the only way. The last thing I'd say is that it was vital that myself and my colleague appeared to be in agreement on everything. Again, it's like the teachers in class, that we were clapping each other on the back as if we were great mates. Behind the scenes, there was blood on the floor, because all these compromises had to be worked out the closer we got to the end. And it got tougher and tougher for him and for me. So he would say, I insist on this, and we spent a couple of days trying to reach agreement among ourselves. But we had a rule that once we reached an agreement on that we would stick by it, we would defend it to all comers, because otherwise, if they could divide us, we were finished. And that trick worked, and he's still speaking to me.
Yeah. And I come up because we had a comment from our online audience that it's a bit hard to understand the questions, and to some extent, David, you have already answered that one here from Andrea Deverell, who's doing a lot of work here on our sustainable reporting and doing excellent work. How did you manage to navigate the complexity collectively and individually in particular? How did you go about identifying individual goals while recognizing the interconnected nature of these complex challenges?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. I should have maybe explained that earlier, that the goals are not just, carefully worded in themselves, but the cross connections between the goals are almost more important. That they call this, the name of the document is Transforming the World. So there is this view that you can only really transform the world, that's to say, end extreme poverty and save the planet by recognizing how one area of human activity impinges on another. So if we follow the wrong policies on health, we will undermine the prospects for a good education outcome, for example. So these interconnections between the goals were very important. I mean, to try and answer Andrea's question, but it's a difficult one. We were asking governments to be able to sort of multitask in their own minds, to balance many competing considerations. So if they look at a health outcome or the health goal, the health minister has to understand that whatever he or she might advance kind of nationally or do nationally is affected by what the education minister is doing, or will affect what the education minister is doing, and the same for agriculture, the same for social protection, that in a cabinet, in a typical government team, that the actions of each minister are conditioned by the actions of all the others and themselves condition it. So this is quite a tall order intellectually. You're asking people to keep a lot of balancing concepts in mind. We're seeing very mixed results around the world, that too many governments still think in what are called silo terms, that the health minister will only look at his or her narrow health portfolio and not look beyond it. And so although governments have signed up to this integrated approach, and they do recognise the logic of it, it's still asking a lot of individual politicians and leaders. So, of course, comparing how other countries are doing, best practices, learning from the example of neighbouring countries or those who are similar to you in size, all of that helps. If Denmark says, we have come up with a great solution for, let's say, connecting education and innovation or whatever, we might learn that idea in Ireland or vice versa. But it does require quite an intellectual adjustment, and it's too comfortable for people to stick in their narrow areas. The Prime Minister in each country has a certain responsibility. I mean, in many ways, the coordination for these SDGs should happen in the office of the Prime Minister or the President worldwide. But, many countries prefer to do it differently. For example, here, and I'm not criticizing necessarily, but here it's the Department of Climate, Energy, Communications, which has the coordinating role. And that's partly because the Taoiseach's Department traditionally does not see itself taking on more and more coordinating functions. But you can debate that. In Germany, it's the Federal Chancellery, for example, and yet in Britain, it's the Foreign Office or something. So nobody has actually achieved a sensible set of arrangements. So we're all still in a learning process. That's probably as much as I can do on Andrea's question for now.
Hi, thank you, David. It's fascinating to listen to. I suppose you mentioned earlier about countries coming back and making presentations. Have there been any exemplary examples of where a cabinet worked together? I mean, I know Norway is very good and everything, but putting Norway aside, has there been,
Very good point. No, there have indeed, and some developing countries, for example, have been ahead of the rest in terms of adopting the SDGs, rearranging their entire government structures around them. An example is Colombia. In the summer in which we were concluding the negotiations, Colombia had already brought in a law based on the draft goals that they saw this is the way everything was heading. So they were showing very good example. They were setting a very good example. Colombia has already come 3 times to present its own review. There are other countries offhand, I think Sri Lanka. Countries like that have in many respects overtaken the developed countries. I should say that I'm using this division knowing that it's no longer accurate, developed and developing. One of the points of the SDGs is to try to establish that there aren't 2 groups of countries. There's really one group of countries, or there is multiple groups. But to put it in perspective, there are 193 countries in the world. Of those, 134 are developing. They organize themselves under the name, which is confusing, the Group of 77. So the group, there were 177 developing countries. The group of 77 has not changed its name, but in the meantime, it has doubled its membership. 2/3 of the countries, therefore, are developing, but that would include, say, China, includes Russia, Brazil. I mean, clearly there are many examples of developing, and say 1/3, roughly speaking, are developed. But in a way, that terminology is out of date now because we have a single document which literally is the same for every country in the world. So that was one thing that my colleague and I were trying to ensure, that there wouldn't be efforts to amend it, or, you know, for certain regions of the world, we wouldn't allow any regional variations. That meant we had to find language which every country could feel in some way represented its interests. And let's take, say, you know, countries who have a dire human rights record. Are they going to accept language on human rights which is very forward, as, for example, Scandinavian countries or Ireland would want to see? That's where the fudging came in. I had to find some way around it. But you know, your question is a very good one. There are many developing countries who, in fact, are taking the new agenda far more seriously and more actively than developed countries. But as you can see, for the moment, we don't really have another name for this binary distinction.
Thanks for that, and David, for your response to that.
Hi, David. Great presentation. I work in the university's Centre for Sustainable Futures and Innovation alongside Andrea. So you mentioned that there's a likely probability that the Sustainable Development Goals won't be achieved by 2030. And if so, you know, fair chance that it'll be extended into Agenda 2040 or Agenda 2045. If it is extended, do you think that a time extension itself will be enough to achieve the goals, or do you think something else may perhaps need to change as far as, you know, different targets?
That's a very good point, and very challenging. I suppose just for shorthand, I'm saying that I think that we'll just change the name and call it the 2040 agenda. But when you try to unpack that, there will be a new negotiation process. Normally speaking, I was expecting it to happen around 2027, 2028. We would begin to hear countries saying, we need a new agenda from 2030 on, and the bits of the previous agenda that we didn't achieve will be folded into the new agenda. Why do I say that? Because that's what we had to do. We had to take the bits of the MDGs that had not been achieved and fold them into the 2030 agenda. Developing countries, as it happens, were very afraid that the MDG stuff, which is about health and education, they were afraid that those goals would be forgotten about, that they were afraid that the developed part of the world would decide on a different set of priorities. So it was very important to them that we didn't lose sight of the MDG. So everything went forward in the 2030 agenda. I suspect that we'll begin to hear talk in about 5 years' time that a new round of negotiations is needed, and that perhaps certain things should be included which we didn't include. I give you an example. Migration. Migration is not, I don't think we'll get a goal as such, but the importance of migration in a positive sense as a means of helping with sustainable development. You know, somebody from Bangladesh will go to London, open a business, and remit money back to Bangladesh. I mean, the positive view of migration, of economic migration, that is not properly reflected in the document we have now. That, I think, there'll be pressure for that. Another one would be the use of, say, new technologies, artificial intelligence, you know, ways of fast forwarding on development. That will also get a mention. I mean, these are just random examples. I don't think anybody will say we don't need goal 6 or goal 5, whatever. I think it'll probably get slightly bigger. As to why it's 17 goals, that was, you know, some countries felt it's an awkward kind of number. Could we not do better than that? The British in particular felt that it should be just 10 or 12, a kind of round number. But the feeling was, look, we had 8 Millennium Development Goals, add in the environment goals, and that probably will double it anyway. And so then there was an argument, even if you decide that you don't like 17 and you want to call it 15, well, which two do you drop? Germany, for example, would not have agreed to dropping an environment goal, and France wouldn't have agreed to dropping the climate goal because they each had a vested interest. So we left it at 17. Another thing, just I'm thinking of random points, you won't believe this, but what we would tend to take for granted in the global north is that you would summarize a large and complex agenda like this. Ministers, after all, might want to have a little note in their inside pockets to remind themselves what these goals are. That seemed obvious to me. It was not obvious to many developing countries who feared, and we have to take it seriously, who feared that if you have any summarizing, it in itself reduces the significance of the goal. If you try to boil it down into a shorter sentence, as it were, that will be detrimental to their interests. So they refuse point blank to have any summary of this huge and unwieldy document. The only way that I could get around that was to bring in the so-called 5 Ps. That's people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. So roughly speaking, people refers to the 5 or so traditional development goals. Planet is the environmental goals. Prosperity would be the economic dimension. Peace is the very important goal 16. And then partnership is goal 17. The fact that they all began with P in English was very handy. It's not so easy in other languages where there'd be many different letters, but the 5 Ps was accepted as a sort of a shorthand summary of the whole thing. And so that's just an example of how there are many cultural differences between North and South, things which we would regard as normal, they were suspicious of. Anyway, you know, I think something very, very similar to this agenda will be the basis of the next 15 years' work, but we're still 7 years off. I suppose we want to keep noses to the grindstone and hope that the shocks we've had recently will somehow be managed and that would get some actual positive growth. I mean, it's such a shame that the world thinks this is the right way to go, but all these shocks have undermined the potential.
Great question. Gisela's reminding me of time here, so I'm obviously chairing this really badly. So apologies.
Very well.
I also have a question that I'd love to ask, but I'm actually going to put my own self-interest behind the interest of the group. So are there any questions you would like to ask? No? Now people are afraid. Well, my question is really quick, and so you can answer it very quickly. I found it really interesting when you started, you know, the success is phenomenal. The fact that the way people have engaged and countries have engaged with the SDGs, I think is incredible. How it's moved to being central and being embedded, I think it's a phenomenal achievement. But I thought it was interesting when you started to say then, you know, what now needs to be done or what possible things, and you mentioned at the beginning the fact that it isn't, I suppose, prescribed in law.
Yes.
And what I wonder, my question for you is, if it was prescribed in law, would you have got the traction that you actually got? And the other question I have for you is that sometimes, you know, we can have these legal norms, but social and moral norms are also really important. Even the simple act of queuing, that idea, yes, you know, that has a really powerful effect and can be used, you know, between countries and may achieve, in some instances, more, even though you don't have the stick of a coercive sanction.
Exactly. I mean, on that chain, you know, it's difficult to imagine that we would have had all 193 countries agreeing to a legally binding regime. And we were either trying to achieve consensus, which means 193, or not. So, I mean, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but it's actually hard to conceive of because so many countries, tiny developing countries, simply wouldn't. They didn't even need to tell us that. We knew instinctively that they wouldn't go along with that. So, but I think to try and address your point more seriously, there are, of course, references made to legally binding documents within the the agenda. And one could imagine in some countries that a legal case might be taken by somebody who would claim that their particular yeah, exactly, let's imagine that there's a target around you know, a lot of it is very aspirational, but say, you know, there is a target relating to reducing the number of road traffic related deaths, for example. You know, say if somebody felt very strongly on that issue and held that his government, having signed the 2030 agenda, should have done more to reduce, bit fanciful, but should have done more to reduce the level of road traffic fatalities. You could, in theory, have a judge who might issue kind of an obiter dicta thing. I mean, you know, you're a lawyer, who would, in effect, issue soft law. I think I heard you say that, Shane. And so that could have a quasi-legal value going forward. Now, I haven't heard so far of that happening, but I could be, you know, perhaps I might be wrong on that. But there is potential for a judge in an individual country to decide that. That these goals and the government signing up to them has more than just a kind of a political aspirational value. It doesn't say anywhere that it's a politically binding agenda. We don't refer to it. So a lawyer could say that, you know, this is it was signed at the level of the head of state, and that this is a serious set of commitments, and every government refers to the Sustainable Development Goals in their programs for government. You know, I mean, it's mentioned in manifestos and so on. So anyway, I am not a lawyer, but you could imagine somebody trying to construct a case to the effect that they have that they are more binding than I'm suggesting.
Didn't answer my question. Any other final questions you would like to ask? No, so I think that we're over time, but I think it was a fascinating discussion. I would like to thank Gisela for coordinating and organising, David, to you for giving us such an insight into the development of these goals, the crafting and the drafting of them, the level of negotiation involved, and how it was done. And I think they've been a tremendous success. And so much of this, obviously,
well, you have to be lucky to the love of the Irish. Could I just add one sentence, because I meant about universities, the role of universities. Believe it or not, universities all around the world are actually using the SDGs as a kind of a frame, a point of reference for their own activities. From my layman's point of view, I'm hugely impressed by this. You know, a university might have a population of 20,000, and I'm seeing countless examples of a university saying, well, the SDGs give us a kind of an organizing principle. After all, research will cover everything in the SDGs, gender equality, human rights, access to water, even food security. There's nothing in the SDGs which is not somehow relevant to the campus, to the university community. And so in the last few years, a number of universities, and I think UL included, is recognizing that the SDGs are a useful kind of framing device. And I think they also help them to apply for funding at European level, that if a university can say, we are working actively to implement the SDGs in our business plans, that helps, if I understand correctly, to get approval, say, from the European Union funding, because, you know, it's a global agenda which everybody regards as important. So that's just my layman's tuppence halfpenny at the end, that universities are a very important way of implementing the SDGs and showing their potential for the society we're all in.
And David, just to add to that, I mean, I think that our president here,
I was saying it partly to Kirsten in the audience, that I know she's already an enthusiast, but it's...
So it's at the level of research across all of the disciplines. It's at the level of curriculum development. So it's what students are being told. It's then at the level of engagement with our staff and our students and the community here, and how we exist here and how we engage with each other and the environment around us. So it should be embodied in the everyday, and it is, and something that's really important to the present.
Great. Thank you very much.
David, Shane, thank you. And all of you here and all of you online, thank you very much. Next week, Wednesday, we're going on with the universities and we're looking at sustainability reporting, sustainability report in Germany by Philipp Nussbaum. Wednesday, 1 o'clock, only online. So I'll see you then again online, hopefully. And for now, just thank you so much. It was brilliant.